Hi guys, I'm sure you have all heard of Chat GPT by now. It has become a buzzword within days of its release. And professionals in all fields, especially in high-skilled areas like lawyers, doctors, engineers, are questioning whether such AI can actually replace them at work. So in this video, I want to talk about what Chat GPT is and how it even popped up, talk a bit about the organization behind Chat GPT called OpenAI, which has already created many other machine learning models besides Chat GPT, and also explain technically about all that. And then we'll dive in and actually put Chat GPT to use for some DevOps related tasks. I really want to see how it can help in generating configuration code for building DevOps processes or different parts of those processes, and how well it knows different DevOps technologies. But not just some shallow examples or boilerplate code that I can get from official documentation, but instead also try more fine-tuning and small optimizations in that configuration code. So we will see all of that. We're also going to check out an open source command line tool that is built on top of ChatGPT and was specifically created for engineers to generate infrastructure as code templates and more. And finally, we'll talk about the impact of ChatGPT, the quality and usefulness of such a tool for engineers, and whether it will really replace the engineers, and to what extent you should be concerned. So let's talk about all of that. First of all, what is ChatGPT and why is it useful? You can think of ChatGPT as something that has all the knowledge from various different fields, including engineering, and has a chat interface where you can ask it to give you some information based on that knowledge in an easily digestible form. And it will analyze and process all that knowledge it has to give you answers in a very human-like manner, as if an actual human professional was writing back. Now, how did this technology even came about? Who created this? ChatGPT was created by a research organization called OpenAI. And according to the company itself and its mission statement, it is actually dedicated to developing and using artificial intelligence in a way that can benefit the general public and basically democratize the access to artificial intelligence as well. So the story is that its founders, among which were Elon Musk and Sam Altman, founded OpenAI because they feared that people and organizations would misuse artificial intelligence or be careless about the development and advancements in AI. And they feared, or still do probably, that this would cause a chaos and disaster for the world. And through OpenAI, they wanted to develop and use AI for the benefit of general public. So that was the idea behind OpenAI organization, which is a non-profit research organization. And OpenAI actually has done really impressive developments in the AI field. It is one of the leading organizations in the AI technology area, and it already has many very ambitious projects, including the development of AI for use in natural language processing, computer vision, robotics, gaming, and so on. And there are some popular high-profile projects that OpenAI has developed over the past years. One of them is DALL-E, for example, which is a neural network, which basically is one specific type of machine learning model that mimics a human brain. So that's what a neural network is. And DALL-E also became pretty famous because it is really impressive and it can create super realistic and very high quality images and art from a simple text description. And another of their projects, a language generation model that can generate human-like text called Generative Pre-trained Transformer, or shortly GPT, which is exactly the model that famous ChatGPT is based on. So that's basically one of several other projects that OpenAI has created. And they actually made several improvements of GPT after its initial development with GPT-2, an extension of the GPT model that was trained on an even larger data set of web pages. And GPT-2 has the ability to generate a wider range of texts, including news articles, whole stories, and poems. And then, even more powerful version was developed, which was GPT-3, which can even produce jokes, puns, and has even wider range of usages, including for language translation, question answering, text summarization, and content creation. So this powerful GPT-3 model was given a human-friendly user interface, which is a chat, and that's how we got Chat GPT, which OpenAI released and made available for general public. And it has seen tremendous explosion in number of users within just days of its release. Now, you probably have already seen some videos on YouTube of software developers demoing some use cases of how ChatGPT produces really good code in any programming language or framework, or how it even fixes bugs when provided a code snippet with certain bug. And now, along with millions of users who have already tried ChatGPT, we want to put it to test and see how it performs, but in our case, specifically for DevOps tasks. So the question is, can we get really useful output from it and get scripts and configuration code for different DevOps tasks? And basically, how qualitative will be the code or scripts for DevOps tasks that ChatGPT is going to produce? And that's exactly what we're going to see in the next section. And with this, let's dive right in the demo part and try out ChatGPT for DevOps. So let's start by opening the ChatGPT site. And as you see, it's on openai.com. So let's click inside, try ChatGPT. And this is basically the URL where it's available. It's chat.openai.com. And if you don't have an account yet, so for the first time, you have to basically sign up and create your account and confirm it from your email address. And once you've signed up, then you can just go to login and you'll be forwarded to the ChatGPT dashboard. And that's basically how it looks like. They may change the UI a little bit in the future, but it's a simple user interface. And that's also one of the reasons for its popularity, because it's super simple and user-friendly to use. So this is basically the starting prompt where you can start a conversation and asking questions to ChatGPT. And that's what we're gonna start from. So I'm gonna do this from a perspective of let's say a junior DevOps engineer who has a vague idea of what they're doing, but wants to use this tool to get the work done most efficiently. So basically use it for research and learning purpose, as well as for actually getting some proper output that they can use at work to implement some DevOps tasks. And let's see if ChatGPT can help here. And here you have a couple of additional information about ChatGPT, like examples of how to interact with it, how to structure your questions, as well as the capabilities. One of the most important capabilities that I think is most valuable that ChatGPT has is actually staying in the context of the conversation. So once you ask questions, you can actually do follow-up questions, so it remembers the previous context within that chat, which is super valuable because you don't have to explain everything from scratch with every question. And they also point out some of the limitations. One of the limitations that you have to consider for sure is that the data that has been fed to ChatGPT is right now at this point till 2021, which means everything that happened afterwards, ChatGPT doesn't know about. So as a first question, let's say I have a JavaScript application with Node.js framework, and I already have the code for the application, and I want to Dockerize it. So I want to create a Dockerfile for my Node.js application. And I'm gonna ask ChatGPT to actually give me a Dockerfile, an example Dockerfile that I can use for my Node.js project. So simple instruction, write a Dockerfile for Node.js application. Let's see what happens. So let's actually see what ChatGPT gave us here. First of all, it gave us an example Dockerfile for Node.js application. So it based it on Node image with a specific version, which is actually very good practice to have a fixed version of a base image. But it didn't just write us a Dockerfile, but it actually gave us explanation of each step in the Dockerfile. So again, from a perspective of a junior engineer that is kind of researching and doing the job at the same time, this is super helpful because not only do you just get a ready Dockerfile, but it also explains to you what is happening on each line. So you can use it to learn in case you don't understand parts of the syntax. So it describes all the steps here, like setting the working directory, copying the file, installing dependencies, and so on. And it doesn't even stop there. It actually gives you some additional useful information, like making sure that you have package.json in your application. And that package.json has a script called npm start inside. And once you have the Docker file that it provides you, then you can build the Docker image using this command, giving your image a name. And then it gives you a command to start a container from the Docker image. So basically all the instructions are there for the next steps as well. So it didn't just give us what we asked for, but it actually gave us more information for the next steps, which is super impressive. Now let's assume the description of one of the lines here is not sufficient, so you want to understand in more detail something in the Docker file. Let's say you want to understand exactly what this work_dir directive does in Dockerfile. So we can ask it, explain exactly what docker_dir directive means in Dockerfile. And this is a really detailed explanation. And what I actually love about this is that it explains the concept or this directive specifically with an example. Like it actually gives you another example of Dockerfile and says, look, in this example, we're setting the work directory at /app. And then when we execute npm install and copy commands, they will actually be executed in that /app directory. And then it also gives you a comparison to something that you may already know, like cd command in shell script. So basically changing into a directory and then executing commands from there. So I think that explanation is actually very good. It's in simple language, and most importantly, it gives you examples and even comparison so that you can understand it better. Now let's say we want ChatGPT to actually adjust the Docker file that it gave us, and instead of npm, use another build and packaging tool called Yarn, which is an alternative to npm. And let's say we're using Yarn in our project, so we want our Docker file to also be using Yarn. So I'm going to instruct ChatGPT to use Yarn instead of npm. And as you see, it actually replaced the npm with Yarn, and it gave us a new Docker file with Yarn commands inside. And again, it tells you to have package.json and have Yarn start script inside, and the Docker build and Docker run commands. Now let's ask it to do even more optimizations in the Docker file. And right here on this line, it is actually copying everything from the projects directory to this Docker image, right? So let's say in the root directory of application, we actually have lots of other files, right? You have git ignore, node modules, maybe tests folder. So you have a lot of code that you don't need in the Docker image, and we don't want to copy all of that inside the Docker image, right? So I'm gonna ask ChatGPT to actually optimize this and only copy the relevant application files. Now, obviously, ChatGPT doesn't know what I have in the application code, so I'm really curious to see how it actually solves this issue. So I'm going to ask it to only copy relevant files or relevant application files, not everything to the app image. And here we have the output from ChatGPT, and I actually think that it handled the task really well, considering that it doesn't even know what I have in the application. So basically what it suggested us to do is create this .docker ignore file. It even explains that it is similar to git ignore file, where you can specify patterns of files or directories. So basically anything that you want to ignore and exclude from ending up in the Docker image. And then it also gives us an example with actually really good realistic examples of excluding node modules and test directory if you have them in your application, and creating this Docker ignore file with these contents. And then it also adjusted the Dockerfile with this additional flag to exclude whatever is in Docker ignore. It took the version with npm and not yarn. So at this point you can actually ask it to rewrite the whole thing in yarn again. But I think the result is actually really good, because using Docker ignore file is also one of the best practices to keep your images smaller. So I think the result is actually really good. And now let's do one more optimization. Let's say again, as a junior engineer, you have heard of this new concept in Docker, which is a multi-stage build, but you have no idea how to actually create a multi-stage build or how the syntax of that will look like in Dockerfile. So you're going to ask ChatGPT to do that for you. So we're going to say use multi-stage build, and let's see what it comes up with. And let's see what we got here. So first of all, it gives you a brief explanation of how to build a multi-stage build, to use multiple froms, and that each from statement starts a new stage in the build process. And you can use the files or output from the previous stage in the next stage, right? Using this copy from directive. And of course, we get an example Dockerfile with two stages, right? We have this from node and then from Nginx. In the first stage, it actually builds the whole application with its dependencies and the code that it's copying into the image. And then in the next stage, it takes that built artifact and runs it with Nginx server and exposes Nginx on port 80 instead of port 3000 that we had before. And then it gives you an updated command to run the image and bind it on port 80. So I think it did a pretty good job, but again, it didn't use yarn as well as that flag on the copy directive to exclude files from Docker ignore file. And finally, in the examples, I also wanted to build an image with a specific tag. So let's actually direct ChatGPT to create the multi-stage build, but with those optimizations. So adjust the multi-stage build to use yarn, exclude app files from Docker ignore file when copying them into Docker image, and provide Docker command examples with a specific image tag of, let's say, 1.0. I have no idea if it's gonna get all of these things right, so let's actually see the result. And I think it actually got all my requests right. So let's see. It replaced the npm commands with yarn commands. which is good. It also added back this exclude from, and it added the version tag to the Docker command examples. So we have my node app 1.0 in Docker build and Docker run commands. So generally, it was actually really good at understanding my requests and adjusting the details accordingly. Awesome. So I think it did pretty well with Docker. Now let's see another example with another tool. Now, before moving on, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, Firefly, which can turn any cloud resource you have into infrastructure as code.
Trying to control your cloud? As the cloud continues to grow, it becomes increasingly difficult to see the full picture. And though your guard is always up, the landscape is totally fragmented and surprises lurk around any corner. Why stay in the dark? Light up your cloud with Firefly. Analyze and identify any unmanaged resources with just a few clicks. Firefly automatically codifies any unmanaged assets into any infrastructure as code tool, keeping your cloud up to code. Unexpected changes causing your cloud to drift away? Get real-time notifications on any drift and remediate them as they occur. Obtain a full overview of your entire cloud footprint across multi-cloud, various infrastructure as code tools, and Kubernetes clusters. Prevent system failure. Replace manual work with automation to reduce toil. And reclaim control over your cloud with Firefly.
So be sure to check them out. You can get started with their free tier offer. They also recently launched a report on the state of infrastructure as code 2023. As usual, I will leave all the relevant links in the video description. And now let's continue with our video. And this time I'm going to use Kubernetes. And I'm actually going to stay in the same chat because we already have a Dockerfile here and some example Node.js application. So I'm going to use this context to create a Kubernetes deployment file for this application. So I'm going to ask it to create a Kubernetes deployment manifest for this image. Okay, so we got the output from Chat GPT, and it actually looks really impressive because of a couple of reasons. First of all, let's go all the way up and see our deployment file. And since I told it to base that Kubernetes manifest file on this Docker image that we created, it actually took that information and reused the same application name as when building this Docker image. But it also reused the image tag 1.0 and the container port from this multi-stage build, right? Where we're exposing this port 80. So it used all this information from Dockerfile to create the deployment manifest file. Now this is obviously a boilerplate code that you can easily grab on Kubernetes official documentation page, but this could actually be a very convenient way to generate these boilerplate manifest files because you can reuse some of the context that you have and ask it to readjust and so on. And another really impressive thing that it did is it just went ahead and just independently gave us an example of a corresponding service manifest file. So this is a service component and it used the load balancer type, which is actually the type of service you should use in production environment. So it used the correct type. It has the selector from the labels provided here. And again, you'd use the target port from the deployment file. And then again, it provided me with kubectl commands for creating or applying the deployment and service files, and even querying the service after it gets created. You will probably get different results for each query or each request that I give ChatGPT. It will be something similar, obviously, but some details may vary, right? So for example, you may have gotten the Dockerfile example with yarn as a default instead of npm. So it could be these kind of differences. Now let's continue with that. And I'm gonna ask Chat GPT to actually adjust this boilerplate deployment file. And by the way, it also gave us 3 replicas instead of 1, which is pretty cool. So I'm gonna ask Chat GPT to adjust this deployment file and add some resource limitations to our container. So add resource quotas to the deployment. Awesome. So let's see the output. It basically just added the resource limits and request configuration in the deployment file, and it used the most standard default values for each configuration, which is pretty good actually. And here is the obvious advantage over just going to the official documentation and getting those examples from there, because when you want to add this kind of configuration, first of all, you have to go and search the example syntax, then you have to remember exactly the right location inside your deployment file to insert that configuration. So ChatGPT actually just does all of that for you, so you don't have to memorize the syntax of the manifest file. So I think that is actually a really big advantage, especially when you're adding lots of configuration here and when you're working with deployment files that are hundreds of lines long, right? Maybe with multiple containers and its configurations. So I can imagine this being super useful in those cases. And again, instead of just providing the example, it actually went ahead and also explained what resource limits and requests are, right? That the limits are used to prevent a single container from using too many resources and causing issue on the host. So I think these details where ChatGPT just goes one step further, and instead of just delivering you the exact result to your query, it actually gives you even more value, explaining conceptually the example and also giving you some follow-up commands that you may need to use, so you can just copy the code and execute on your terminal instead of typing out. So I think these details are actually pretty cool. Now I want to try out one more thing, which is instead of me just saying, please add resource quotas or some specific configuration, I want to give ChatGPT a more generic request so that it can handle the underlying details for me. So let's say I don't know exactly what the most ideal deployment manifest looks like. So I'm going to ask ChatGPT to take over that task for me. So I'm going to ask it to adjust the deployment manifest with production and security best practices. So I'm not giving a specific instruction to insert a configuration. Instead, I'm saying whatever the production and security best practices are, please just add them in the manifest file. So let's actually see what it comes up with. All right, so let's see the output here. First of all, it started out by listing all the things that are best practices and production practices for deployment file. And this list is actually really good. So it says that resource limits and requests should be configured, the liveness and readiness probes, so that if container isn't working, it's automatically detected and restarted, etc. Not to hard code any passwords or tokens inside as a security best practice, and also to consider access permissions, right? So who can do what in the cluster and so on. However, the deployment file was not actually adjusted, and plus there are a couple of other things that it could have mentioned as a security best practice, for example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat my request and let's see what happens. So first of all, I'm going to say it seems like some best practices are missing. So please adjust deployment file properly with production and security best practices without explanations. Just provide the example manifest file. Let's see what happens. Okay, so this looks way better than before. And there is one thing that I also noticed when I was playing around with ChatGPT is that sometimes it basically starts giving you the answer and it kind of stops at some point. I think there is sometimes a limitation to the output. So that's why I told it to basically spare me the explanation and just give me the example so it has enough space for the answer. So it actually could be that it just stops midway and you can just say, keep explaining or continue with the response or whatever. So let's actually take a look at the adjusted deployment file. And after this resource configurations, it actually added the liveness probe, the readiness probe, which are the best practice configurations. If you want to automatically detect when container isn't working, etc. It also added the image pull secrets when you're pulling the image from a private repository, which is super nice because all this configuration, again, you have to look up the syntax because I don't think you can remember all these attribute names and key value pairs by heart and exactly where they go. So it's really nice that it basically just puts all of that together for you. It also added volumes for secret and config map, and also added the service account name. So basically all the things that it listed above as production security best practices, like using liveness and readiness probes, the resource limits, secrets, roles, etc. It added all this configuration in the deployment file, which is awesome. I'm going to ask it to do one more configuration and basically just add it on top of this example. And let's see whether it can do that. So on top of that new configuration options, also add security context configuration in the deployment file. So let's see. And it actually added the security context configuration on top of the previous deployment file. And this is basically a configuration where we're saying that container should run as a user that is not root, right? So any user which is not root, and that's also kind of one of the security best practices, not to run containers as root. One of the best practices. So even if the container was built to run with root user, with security context, it is actually overriding that configuration to avoid that security risk. And here it says as well, run as non-root, true. So this deployment file actually looks pretty good. And of course, when you start using it and you, again, from a junior engineer's perspective, you don't know exactly how to create the other components which are referenced here. You can keep asking ChatGPT, okay, now how do I create the secret? Or how do I create the service account? Or configure the volumes, etc. So basically, you can put together the rest of the configuration around this deployment file. But again, my general impression is that the output is actually pretty good considering the nuances and details. However, sometimes you actually need to have the knowledge yourself to validate the output, because again, if you're a junior engineer and you have this more or less vague idea and you don't know all the details, it could be difficult to validate the output, or in some cases to formulate the request properly to get the high quality output. Now I'm going to try one more thing, which is a little bit more complex, and I'm really curious to see how ChatGPT can handle that. And I'm actually gonna stay in the same chat to reuse some of the context. And I'm gonna use Chat GPT to actually build a CI/CD pipeline code in Jenkins. So after a couple of queries to ChatGPT, we should actually end up with a Jenkins file, which has the complete CI/CD pipeline code, or at least the main part of it configured. And note that I want it to reuse the context that it already has from this chat, like the Kubernetes files, Dockerfile, our Node.js application, and so on. So I'm gonna ask now to write a Jenkins file for the complete CI/CD pipeline for the above Node.js application, including deployment to Kubernetes cluster. And let's see. All right, now let's see the output. I believe that the output is not always the same for everybody, so you may actually be seeing some completely different results. It's actually interesting to compare and see how many different options or versions ChatGPT comes up with for the same request. So let's actually check out our CI/CD pipeline. First of all, it actually reused yarn instead of npm for build and test stages, which is pretty good. So it's building the application and it's running the test, considering there are some tests in the application. Then it does build Docker image and push Docker image stages separately. So I guess in some instances, this stage will be put together instead of separately. And this is also very interesting that it automatically decided to use the build number environment variable from Jenkins as the image tag, right? So this is actually very good because it makes sure that a unique image with a unique tag is generated every time the build runs, right? So that's actually pretty good that we don't have a hard-coded image tag like 1.0. And then this is another interesting part. In deploy to Kubernetes stage, it actually knows that kubectl needs to use the kubeconfig to connect to the cluster and to authenticate with the cluster. So this kubeconfig file will include all the credentials to connect to the cluster, which is a sensitive information. And because of that, it assumed that it should come from Jenkins credentials. So I think this part is actually really impressive, that it automatically knows that this is a sensitive or secret information and it should be in a Jenkins credential, and then automatically comes up with just some credential ID that you can now use to create that credential, and gives you the syntax to read from the Jenkins credential as kubeconfig file and basically just executes the command with that configuration. So I think the result is actually not bad. There are just a couple of things that are missing here, which is first of all, Docker login command to log into a repository before we can actually push the image there, which should actually happen before. And also, this is only updating the image in the deployment in the cluster, but is not applying the whole deployment file or service file. So again, we can give it some additional instructions to adjust this pipeline with all these additional steps. So I'm going to ask it to adjust the Jenkins file to have one stage for building and pushing the Docker image and logging in to the Docker repository, let's say on Docker Hub. And in the final stage, apply deployment and service files to the cluster, but keep the kube config parameter. Let's see. Okay, so the result does not look exactly what I was looking for, which could also mean that my prompt, my request wasn't properly formulated. So it adjusted the deploy to Kubernetes part with right configuration. So it's deploying the deployment, or it's applying the deployment and service file changes, but it kept this kubeconfig file. And here it basically just put everything together. So I'm gonna ask it to change this stage, because this obviously doesn't look very good. So keep the build and test stages as they were initially, but create a separate stage for building a Docker image and pushing to Docker repository. But before pushing image, make sure to log in to the Docker repository first. Let's see. Okay, now this looks better. We still have those build and test stages. And here it is building the image, then logging into Docker Hub. Again, using the credential, or assuming that because it's a password, it should get it from the credentials, from Jenkins credentials, and using it here. And this is also actually a good practice to use password standard in option instead of passing it as a password flag directly, like the username. It could have also gotten the username from credentials, like the password, but it didn't. And it also didn't add the Kubernetes deployment from the previous example. So I'm gonna ask it to add deployment, deploy to Kubernetes stage, as in the previous example. Also read the Docker Hub username as a credential, just like the Docker Hub password, but call them Docker user and Docker pass pwd respectively, and also use the credentials function instead of with credentials to read both of these values. So I actually put a couple of directives to adjust some details in the Jenkinsfile, and I'm really curious to see what it comes up with now. Okay, so build and test look fine. So I think it got most of my instructions right. First of all, it changed the variable values to Docker user and Docker pwd, which is great. And now it's reading the user also from the credential. So it has this Docker Hub credentials, and it reads both values from that credential. And again, we have this Docker login command and then Docker push. And it added the Kubernetes deployment stage also in the pipeline code. One thing that it didn't do is replacing this with credentials function. So this is kind of the base of Jenkinsfile or CI/CD pipeline that you can then build on top of. And I think the result is actually not very bad. Again, I assume that different people may get different results on the same request or query, so your Jenkinsfile may actually look a little bit different. But of course, you would have to do some optimizations here, right? So for example, the deployment file that we let Chat GPT generate for us has this hard-coded image tag inside, 1.0. So of course you would have to dynamically set that or adjust that to be my node app build number, whatever the value is, instead of hard-coded 1.0. So that could be one of the optimizations. You could add deployment to multiple stages like development, testing, production, etc. So I'm going to use this as a foundation to extend. I'm going to do one final thing here and ask ChatGPT to add another stage for a Slack notification about the pipeline build status. So add a step to notify or stage to notify team through Slack channel about the build status. So this is an example that it gave us. Notify Slack stage with a step that basically executes this Slack send function for a success message, right? And it also tells us how Slack notification plugin should be configured with the link. So that's actually pretty good. And this is what I mentioned, where sometimes just in the middle of reply, it just stops. So it kind of gave us half of that Jenkinsfile, but it suggested us to put that as a final step after deploy to Kubernetes. One thing that I'm missing here is actually the failure notification. So this one actually sends just success message, but it should also send a message when build failed, right? So I'm going to instruct it to consider both cases. So Slack notification should be sent either for failure or success and should always execute after the pipeline or after the build is finished as the last step. And let's see. Okay, so this time it actually provided better result than previously. First of all, it's using post block, which is executed after all stages have completed, regardless of success or failure. So that's what we need. And then it basically checks whether the result was success, in which case it sends build succeeded, otherwise build failed. It could have used the success and failure blocks, would have been a little bit cleaner and easier, but this looks better than the previous example. And then again, it stopped just midway, so I can actually tell it to continue with your response. And it's gonna give us rest of the Jenkins file with the post block edit. So it provided us with the Jenkins file with this Slack notification step at the end. However, it actually forgot to put that whole thing in a separate stage after the deploy to Kubernetes stage. So overall impression for this specific task for building the CI/CD pipeline, it wasn't actually as good. So you definitely need a lot of knowledge yourself to build a CI/CD pipeline, because you can't 100% rely on the results that ChatGPT gives you. However, it is definitely helpful in building like the base syntax and configuration that you can then kind of optimize on. And I think the most value you can get here is when you actually know what the pipeline should end up with, but you don't have the exact syntax in mind, or you don't know exactly the plugins that are available for a specific task. You can actually put together a pretty good pipeline code with specific requests. So it could be valuable in those scenarios. And finally, as a very, very last step, I actually want to try out one more thing, which is taking this whole Jenkins file, and I'm actually going to leave out this Slack notification part. so Jenkinsfile without this last step. And I'm going to ask ChatGPT to give me a GitLab CI equivalent of this Jenkins file. I'm going to paste it in, and I think I am actually missing the final curly brace here. So I'm going to edit. There you go. And so basically it should give me the CI/CD pipeline configured in Jenkinsfile, but for GitLab CI. So with GitLab CI syntax. And I'm going to execute, and let's see what it gives us. All right, so I think this time ChatGPT actually did a really good job of converting our Jenkins file to GitLab CI.yaml file. It gives us some immediate differences as an explanation here, and this file actually looks pretty good. So we have the stages that we had in Jenkins file. However, here it mixed up the stages or the configuration for stages a little bit, and it basically put yarn install and yarn build in build and push stage. So these two stages basically were ignored, but some of the configuration is pretty good. So for example, it is using before script correctly, where it's logging into Docker before it builds and pushes the image. It also detected that it needed an execution environment with Docker in it to execute those commands. And in the deploy stage, again, it uses the before script to configure the kubeconfig location. So in this .kube folder. So again, you will definitely need to do some adjustments and optimizations here. But I think as a base configuration file, especially considering that it was generated or mapped from the Jenkins file directly, I think it's a pretty good base configuration to build on. So these were some of the examples that I thought would be realistic to use ChatGPT for some DevOps tasks, especially from a perspective of someone who is learning and doesn't know these technologies very well, like examples of how they can use ChatGPT to make their work more efficient. There's definitely some room for improvement in terms of accuracy, because you also have to be able to validate the output and can't 100% rely on it when it doesn't give you accurate results. But for a little bit more experienced engineers, I think this is a really good way to become more productive, to save a lot of time, especially in generating this base configuration or boilerplate configuration that you can then optimize and build on top of. And since you are able to also validate the result, I think it can save you a lot of time, and it can be a lot of help in scripting and writing this configuration file as code, infrastructure as code, and all this automation code basically. So you don't have to memorize the syntax and configuration and all the details. So I think this could be a really helpful tool in that. Now, as I mentioned, ChatGPT is one of the projects of OpenAI. And OpenAI actually provides an API, which is open source, and anyone can build on top of that. So there are many companies or individual developers out there who actually create models based on OpenAI's API. So they reuse all these resources that OpenAI provides and all these trained models basically, and they kind of optimize on top of that, like providing a better UI and user-friendly experience, or training the model further for a specific use case. Like you have a tool based on OpenAI's technology, but specifically for answering legal questions, or a tool that lets you do some specific engineering tasks, and so on. So the idea is, instead of having a general purpose tool that does pretty much everything, you have a tool that is trained for a specific use case or set of tasks, and it does that one thing really well. And as a perfect example of that, Firefly, the company who sponsored this video, actually created an open source CLI tool based on ChatGPT model that specifically works for infrastructure as code generation. and it's called AIaC. So basically it's an open source command line tool that lets you generate infrastructure as code templates, scripts, configuration code, utilities, queries, whatever, with a simple command line command. So basically all the tasks that we just did with ChatGPT. So let's actually see that in action and how useful can it be when working on DevOps tasks. You can install it with a simple brew command or even run it as a Docker container if you want. I have already installed it. You need to also generate an API key on OpenAI platform itself and provide that API key through environment variable when executing the AIaC commands in order to authenticate with OpenAI. And it's actually a very simple, straightforward method. It probably took me 2 minutes to install and set the whole thing up. And I'll provide the link to the guide in the video description. And once you're all set up, now we can go ahead and use it to generate some configuration files for us. So I just executed a simple brew install command and then basically just set the environment variable for OpenAI API key to the API key that I just generated on their site. And once you have all of that set up, we're ready to go and actually generate some infrastructure as code scripts, manifests, any DevOps configuration files. So just like in our previous example, let's ask AIaC to generate a Dockerfile for Node.js application. And the command for that is AIaC get, and then we're going to say Dockerfile for Node.js application. And let's see what we get. So this is our Dockerfile. It uses npm. It basically installs all the dependencies, then copies all the files and starts the application using npm script. And now this is actually a very useful part where it asks you to either regenerate the result. So you can ask it to give you a different example. So we can do R for retry. And it's gonna try to generate a code example again. So this time it gave us a little bit different configuration. So for example, it took an Alpine version of the base image, which is probably going to be smaller in size. It also used a different work directory. It is now also copying package lock.json and so on. So it actually gave us a different code example. And a very convenient thing you can do with it is actually save the results, whatever was output in the console. You can save it directly into a file. So I'm going to do S, so save, and it's going to ask in which file should I save it. So we can tell it to create a Dockerfile and save the output there. And now we should have a Dockerfile that was created with that code example. So that's how you can use the tool. Now let's try another example where we ask AIaC to generate some example Terraform script for creating an EC2 instance. Again, AIaC get this time Terraform for EC2 instance, or let's say for 2 EC2 instances. So we got this pretty basic Terraform script for defining these 2 resources. Again, we can do retry and let's see what other template it comes up with. And this time it gave us a little bit different example with the AWS provider configuration for providing your AWS credentials and defining your region. And also, instead of having 2 separate resources, it basically just added a count attribute here to avoid some code redundancy. Again, if you're unhappy with the results, you can do retry as many times as you want. And once you're happy with the configuration, you can save it directly into a file. So I'm going to do S, and let's say I want to save it into main.tf file. And if we check main.tf, we should have that code example in the file. So that's basically how you can use this tool to help you in generating some boilerplate code, to give it some commands for different technologies, for Docker, Terraform, Ansible, Kubernetes manifest files, whatever we need in our DevOps tasks. and use it as your small CLI DevOps assistant, basically. So apart from the fact that you can use it on a command line interface, I find it convenient that you don't get any unneeded text explanations with every output. So ChatGPT explains the examples, which is great for learning and understanding the output. And you could actually tell ChatGPT to not give you any explanations, just the code. But here you just get the code snippet that you asked for without any text around it, and you can then just directly save it into a file. Just a convenient thing. Now you can go ahead and install and play around with this tool yourself if you want. I will, as always, leave all the relevant links in the video description below, so make sure to check that out. So overall, what do I think about ChatGPT? Will it replace engineers? Are engineering jobs threatened? And is everything I said in my latest video about getting into IT still relevant? I remember with the first advancements of AI, people were saying that AI can do certain things better than humans and replace the boring, repetitive, tedious, and less creative tasks that humans don't want to do anyways, like memorizing stuff, calculating, researching, and analyzing tons of data and so on. So humans would be free to do more thought-provoking and creative tasks. But now we are seeing AI doing those human feat tasks pretty good as well. AI can do exactly those creative, complex tasks like creating digital art, images, and videos, often better than humans. And I mentioned this project DALL-E, one of OpenAI's models, which can do exactly that. Also, other creative things like troubleshooting an issue, fixing a code, writing up a legal document, or writing a whole creative story or article. However, one thing that hasn't changed yet is that AI, like ChatGPT, still needs to be used by humans. And that's the whole point, right? Using AI so humans can be more productive. So the fact that AI can do certain tasks better than humans does not necessarily mean that you need less engineers. It means that the engineers will become more efficient, so the same number of engineers can do more stuff faster. So it accelerates the growth and speed of development, which obviously every company wants to have, right? Now, I believe what actually is threatened by ChatGPT is the pretty outdated educational system throughout the world. And the problem is that the modern educational system, even the higher education like universities, focus more on teaching to memorize stuff and things which humans are weaker at than a computer. Learning things from books, research results, things that have happened and other people have done, like lawyers memorizing legal texts. And instead they focus less on teaching the creative and analytic, independent thinking, or even teaching to use AI tools to do more creative stuff. So professions like tax advisors, lawyers, graphic designers, especially ones doing more or less standard work, can be very well replaced by a better, cheaper, and faster AI. So in those fields, we may have only the top players who will still generate value over AI by doing more complex work. And they will be using AI to do their job at a higher level. And that's what I personally think a logical development of things may look like for these professions. And this means we need to start working on a high level and start critical thinking, problem solving, and how to use AI to solve actual problems and generate value, instead of simply carrying out the tasks that AI can do better than us. We need to be ones envisioning and planning what needs to be done. Now, in terms of engineers, I believe that AI will not be able to fill the gap of deficit that still exists for different engineering roles. Because the IT industry is the fastest developing one, with more new fields being added, each field itself expanding and encompassing more skills. Think about some of the IT professions like blockchain developer or machine learning engineer, data scientist, how new these professions are compared to some traditional professions. Like they didn't even exist decades ago and weren't even a realistic career path options, right? So maybe some engineering roles will replace or outgrow others, but if there is one profession or skill that will grow in demand, that's engineers. Engineers play a crucial role in the design, development, and implementation of new technologies and systems, and their skills and knowledge will actually continue to be more in demand as long as there are new challenges and problems to solve. So my latest video on getting into IT is probably even more relevant now than ever with the development of AI, considering the engineering jobs will become even more demanded. That being said, I also believe that engineers who do not learn new skills, don't grow professionally, and don't adapt to the technological changes and kind of stay in their comfort zone, just doing the same tasks, will be replaced or automated by AI at some point in the future. But I think that's really the exceptional case, considering that IT projects are actually very dynamic and you always have some kind of incentive to grow and develop your skills as an engineer. So as long as you as a developer grow your skills and knowledge at a normal speed, which often happens naturally when you work as an engineer, I think you're going to be more than fine. But even in the case where a specific engineering role or job may become automated through AI, having the base foundation in IT will actually help you transition to any other IT field way easier compared to people who are just getting into IT without IT background. And we see that with system administrators who are increasingly transitioning to cloud engineering or DevOps engineering. They're just adapting, and it's of course way easier for them to transition into those fields having the backgrounds that they have. So overall, engineers are needed now more than ever given the speed of development in tech world. But you need to be ready to learn new things and adapt to the changes in tech. And one of those new things you will need to learn as an engineer may actually become the actual skill of using AI tools. Things like prompt engineering, which basically means preparing, formulating your request in the best way to get the most optimal output from the AI tool. In that sense, AI should be considered as an additional tool in the toolset of an engineer to do their job. So that's my take on the whole thing. I would be interested to know what are your thoughts on AI, and have you actually used any AI tool, maybe Chat GPT, at your work already as an engineer, and what were the results? Share them in the comments because I'm sure it will be interesting for other viewers as well. And with that, thank you for watching and see you in the next video.